Every second Indian is below the age of 25. What kind of country do they want to grow up in and leave for their children? Is, I think, ultimately what all of these battles are about.
Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhary. Thanks for watching Inquiry. Sometimes it's crucial for us to meet those we demonize to assess what is it we truly fear. It's 2 weeks since 84-year-old tribal rights activist Stan Swamy, who spent his life in service of the disenfranchised and poor, died in custody. Stan was accused of being an enemy of the state and arrested under the terror law UAPA. So what does his death really symbolize? What does it say about our democracy? As we're surrounded by surveillance and snooping scandals and debates around the sedition law, it's even more important for us to understand who are we positioning as enemies at our gate? What is this mindset that the state is so scared of? To discuss this, I have social activist Harsh Mander on the show. Like Stan, Harsh has spent many decades advocating for communal harmony and constitutional rights. He is avowedly a peace activist, and yet he was positioned as an apostle of hate. As more and more activists are blacklisted and sidelined, do listen in to assess for yourself the rights and wrongs of this landscape. This interview was recorded a few days ago. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure, Shoma. I look forward to the conversation myself.
So, Harsh, I wanted to start with Stan Swamy. The death of this 84-year-old activist while still in custody has created real outrage, shame, real sense of horror actually in people across our society. Many of the facts of his case now is well known. He's been in the news. So he's an 84-year-old activist in Jharkhand, was standing up for tribal rights, has been working for many decades there. And he was accused as part of the Bhima Koregaon case, accused of links with Maoists. And he's been in jail under the UAPA, the terror law, without, a trial and without even charge sheets being filed. And he passed away in custody. So that is well known, Harsh. But can you encapsulate for our audience why this case has created the kind of outrage it has? And what does it really symbolize? What are the deeper fault lines of our country that it symbolizes?
Yeah, Shoma, I did feel the afternoon he passed away, our democracy in a sense was diminished significantly for many reasons. I was privileged to meet Stan Swamy. Delegation of the Karwan-e-Mohabbat had gone some time back to express solidarity. And I encountered a man who truly should in these times, any times, be treated as a national hero, a treasure in many ways. He represents, to my mind, the best that we are capable of. Now, here's a man who was born in Tamil Nadu, became a priest, but through his entire life as a priest, he stood by a certain set of values. Standing with the poor. He quoted somewhere that somebody had said that I speak for the poor and they call me a communist, and that's pretty much what would apply to him as well. He lived in one small room, a very simple life. We met him after the case in Bhima Koregaon had been instituted. 40 police persons had sort of raided his ashram. But he was very calm. And he spoke about some things that I think it's important for the audience, your audience to understand. He spoke about his work in Jharkhand. He said Jharkhand is a very rich and a very poor state at the same time. And people who come here to enrich themselves go back very rich. But the people here are getting poorer and poorer. And I felt I needed to take sides with those who were at the sort of bottom end of India's development paradigm. A particular case, I think, is interesting and illustrative, and he spoke to me about it. The Adanis have a coal plant in Australia, which was running at a loss. The Adani made a plan to establish a large super thermal power project in forested tribal Jharkhand, and displaced, very poor people. Uh, Interestingly, the 100% of the power from this project was going to Bangladesh. It's being sold to Bangladesh. The law normally requires that you have a significant percentage for the local people, but that was exempted. Interestingly, Bangladesh is paying twice the amount that NTPC would have charged for the power. And he was, at the forefront of opposition to this project. He also spoke about, several hundred young Adivasi men and women who had, in their protests against this, this injustice, had been put in prison. And he and Sudha Bhardwaj actually started a committee for defense of these prisoners. And both of them are in jail under the Bhima Koregaon case. Both of them had nothing to do with Bhima Koregaon. He'd never visited it. But I think you can join the dots. A state, to my mind, is known by, can be known best by who it chooses as its adversaries. And that people like Stan Swami and incidentally Sudha Bhardwaj, I was worked in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh as an IAS officer, and I was always in huge admiration for her, for the kind of work she did, the courage, giving up. She had US citizenship. She came, she was living in a Mazdoor Basti, learned law, lived a very simple life, very similar, in fact, to Stan Swami. And these are people who have been jailed for their opposition to a certain form of development in defense of India's poorest, most vulnerable people. Of course, the dignity with which he carried himself, I think, is also worth noticing. And the inhumanity of the state response. He had Parkinson's. He was not able to drink water and do his basic bodily functions alone. He offered that, I'm available for any kind of investigation. The NIA insisted on his transportation to Bombay, and it's interesting that not a single day did they actually, he was in jail throughout. They didn't even interrogate him for a single day. The evidence is supposed to be some letters with Maoists that were, which were found on his computer allegedly, but we know about how this can be done. And he went in, the statement he gave when he went in was, I'm not alone. There are other very fine people who have been charged with me. And I'm proud to be part of them because I haven't stood by when injustice has happened. And I'm willing to pay the price. He actually said these words.
Harsh, I'm sorry. I'm just going to butt in because, like I was saying, that to some extent, the broad outlines of Stan's case and the way he has been treated is, I hope, somewhat known now because there's at least been a little bit of media coverage. So I was really looking for the deeper issues at stake for people to understand, why this case is not just an individualized case. Like Stan said, he represented
yeah. I think that, three things that, three different aspects that we need to understand. Firstly, that we have laws like the UAPA, which allow the executive to jail almost indefinitely people who dissent with it, and for courts to deny bail as routine, and with no opportunity, literally for years, to actually have the evidence tested in a court of law. The actual conviction under UAPA has been 2.2%, quite significantly. I was thinking, go back a century to the whole agitation against the Rowlatt Act, which actually brought Gandhi ji to the forefront of the freedom struggle, led to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. What were they protesting? They were protesting precisely about a law which allowed the colonial government to imprison people without bail, who were opposed to it. 100 years later, in democratic free India, we are in a sense grappling and living with this same law. And I must say very loud and clear that the UAPA, these amendments about bail were actually brought in by the UPA government. It's another matter that this present government has sort of, gone
using
with its usage. But there has been a political consensus with successive governments to have laws which allow the withdrawal of some very basic tenets of natural justice. You are innocent until you're proved guilty. Uh, you get bail as a matter of course in a
Time bound way.
what this laws like this have done has been to turn all
Overturn.
of that on its head, saying that there are times when the country's security is more important than the human rights of particular individuals. Now, this has been the argument, and I think that it's a time, Stan Swami we know, Sudhas Bhardwaj we know, but there are literally tens of hundreds of people who have been kept in jail for many years of their life.
Yeah,
And
in fact, the statistic on that is shocking. It's 7 out of 10 people in Indian jails are under trials, Many of them, the trials haven't begun. So
one part is under trials, but under trial under these special laws. I mean, you have Muslim men, for instance. Over the last, I was studying this. I wrote a piece in the EPW, Terror Innocence. We are seeing Muslim men who have been spent 10 years, 15 years, 22 years in jail are now being released, declared innocent, because these laws allowed that kind of injustice. Who's going to give them back those 22 years of their life, those 15 years of their life? What happens to their families? And when the conviction rate is so low, it can be no one's case that we're actually catching terrorists. You're actually using this law to evade your responsibility, to find the actual people who are actually guilty of terror and to collect the evidence against them. So I think that's one point that we need to understand. A second point is, sorry.
No.
Sorry, would you?
No,
you're seeing the larger picture. I think the second point is how, to some extent, earlier governments have misused these laws to silence dissenters. Again, to place the record, correctly, the UPA government did use it against people who were protesting against a nuclear plant, for instance. But with this government, it has, completely, I think, destroyed all. You have the Bhima Koregaon case, where some violence ensued. A lot of the reports say that people with saffron flags attacked, one person died. And a few months later, they suddenly turned it on its head and said, no, it was a Maoist conspiracy to create this kind of violence. And behind it was a plot to assassinate the prime minister. And a whole set of people who had nothing to do, most of them had nothing to do with Elgar Parishad and Bhima Koregaon, like the two people I've mentioned. And they find themselves charged on very flimsy evidence. In the Delhi riots, it's even, it's quite dramatic because, again, it's been, they said there's a conspiracy behind the riots by a group of people. My name is also mentioned in a number of charge sheets. And it's quite extraordinary to be charged with, being part of a urban Maoist planning an insurrection against the state, hate mongering, and so on and so forth. I think the third larger picture that you have is how the criminal justice system and its actors are using these laws with immense cruelty, with completely mindless cruelty. Just in Stan Swami's case, here's an 84-year-old man who can't even dress, etc., without help. First, you put him into jail, then put him into a crowded barrack. The only people, in fact, Stan Swami recounted with great affection that it was actually other prisoners in his barrack who actually helped him go to the toilet, change his clothes, etc. We all know that even to get a sipper to drink water, 50 days of petitioning by his lawyers to do something that the jailer didn't need anyone's permission. He should have done it the first day. Why have we become so cruel? He would never talk about himself, even in his few letters. He would talk about, I'm spending time with poor prisoners and their injustice, etc. But towards the end, he started saying that my bodily functions have completely declined. And I don't think I'm going to survive. And the last time he spoke to the court, he said, just let me be among my own. which is in Ranchi. He doesn't have any close relatives. He just wanted to be with his brother priests and with the Adivasi youth who were like his sons and daughters. That was denied to him. He died lonely on a hospital bed. So I think that we need to look at all of these aspects to understand why his death, if it doesn't, it should be an inflection point. It should be another Nirbhaya moment for us to reflect on these questions. But if it is not, it only means that our conscience is dead.
Absolutely. Harsh, when I was listening to you, there are just so many strands of conversation that one wants to explore. So, one is, like you said, the sheer inhumanity with which Stan Swami was treated. But it's important to understand what is that mindset that allows people like Stan Swami and Sudha Bhardwaj, who have really lived in service of the nation, to be labeled as, as threats to the nation. One has to think about that and engage with that. So as I was listening to you, I was thinking there are 4 areas through which people who actually protect the Constitution are outlawed or blacklisted, is through the fact that they're seen as anti-development or a threat to national security, or it doesn't sit with the idea of nationalism, or it's communal. These are the 4 big windows through which people are really blacklisted. And I wanted to look at each of those and the 3 groups upon whom the state actually ends up being unjust is tribals, Dalits, and Muslims, by and large. So I really want to examine these issues and why society and the media and the government and courts are becoming hostile to activists, So that's really like a very complex canvas.
It's the middle class. I mean, we must underline that it's a certain influential segment of our society.
Right? Yeah, that's important to underline. So I just want to start, because Stan Swami is the inflection point. The community that he was working with were tribals in Jharkhand. You worked in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. And, when you were describing the conditions he met in jail, he wrote a letter where he also spelt out what he was fighting for all these years. And it was the 5th schedule of the Constitution, which is giving tribals rights over their own region. It was the PISA, which is the Panchayat Extension Act, which again is meant to give tribals and Gram Sabhas the right to decide about development projects. The Forest Rights Act, the protection, like the Land Acquisition Act, the social impact has been written away, and the persecuted prisoners solidarity group, which is again those who have been falsely, put in jail. So these are actually very constitutional fights, but in the eyes of others, this is completely anti-national activity. So can you help our audience understand what are the tribal conditions in these states? What is this fight, and why does the government not look in this with a sympathetic eye?
I think it first boils down to the core question of what is development. And we are told that activists like Stan Swami, Sudha Bhardwaj, who oppose large projects which displace Adivasis from their lands, from their forests, are actually against development. This is the charge. In fact, there was one report which actually said the work of people, including Greenpeace, has cost GDP growth of 2 to 3%. I don't know how they never explained how they reached that figure. But on the altar of what we call GDP growth, the suffering of people who bear those burdens is considered necessary collateral damage. Even as a civil servant, I have been in both in the Narmada region and in Singrauli, and I fought similar battles within the government, saying that what kind of development is this which is going to impoverish, destroy large communities of our poorest people. So I think that's a discourse that this underlies. It was bad enough, at the time when Medha Patkar was at the forefront, where it was government which was establishing projects which were displacing people in large numbers. Now we've moved to yet another, an even more, to my mind, unconscionable phase, of this battle, because largely now the displacement is for large for-profit private companies of the kind that I described with Adani's. So we find, here's something that I would, quite clearly say is obvious crony capitalism at the highest levels of both countries. Why would you be buying electricity at twice the price and so on? Why would you be supporting this kind of displacement? Why are basic elementary rights established after long struggle of the kind that you described being abrogated with such impunity? These are questions that I think we need to ask. When I was in college, there was a slim book that many of us used to read. It was Schumacher's Small is Beautiful. The subtitle is quite lovely. It says, Economics as if People Matter. If you want to go back further, Gandhiji said, in doubt, think of the most vulnerable person you know, and think of whether what you're doing is improving her life. Quite clearly, we are destroying the lives of the poorest and calling that development. And I think that's a fundamental question. So laws, what these say in principle is that people who are displaced by these programs, projects must be consulted, and there must be open public hearings. The costs and benefit must incorporate, not just a calculation of the cost of their land, but what human costs are going to be paid by the displacement of those communities. And that if they have to be displaced, the state, in a sense, has a responsibility to ensure that they're economically secured and better off than they were before. Now, these are I think, are highly inadequate attempts to protect and defend the Adivasis in this development model. But even those have been thrown to the winds. Go back sometimes to Chhattisgarh, and you see, coal mines, super thermal projects, etc., have impoverished over the last 2 decades, 3 decades, the poorest people. And it has been done with the consent of the state and even local officers. I was in Raigad, where I used to be collector many years ago. And when I revisited it, the district 20 years later, it was devastated as far as the poor were concerned. The forests were destroyed. The people had been displaced in large numbers. And I spoke to the collector, who was quite a fine young person. I said, how have you permitted this? And he told me that we are genuinely faced with a dilemma, because we are told that if we don't, support and encourage and fast track these projects, which are for-profit projects by very big corporations, we are going against the interests of the nation. And I sort of argued with him for a long time and explained to him that who constitutes the nation in your mind and mine? And are the large mass of the poor not, central to this nation, our imagination of this nation? And secondly, I said, even if you go beyond the ideological question, there are laws that oblige you, to consult, to seek consent, to provide substantial levels of rehabilitation. You cannot not do those. The demonization of people like Stan Swami in the popular middle class imagination is because of two very different understandings. Is a mode of development which makes the lives of the poorest better, the only real form of development, or is the suffering for a generation or 2 or 3 of the poor a cost that they will pay so that we enjoy development?
Yeah. So, Harsh, even my journalism has always sort of been in defense of the disenfranchised. Yeah. So in many ways, we'll seem as though we're echo chambers. So I want to put to you some of the thoughts where, I speak to a lot of people in government, ministers, when Mr. Chidambaram was home minister, or now people in the BJP or in the corporate world, and even in the middle class imagination, as you said. People look at people like you and Sudha Bhardwaj, Binayak Sen, Himanshu Kumar, Stan Swami, people who really given up a lot of their lives to serve the poor. But the hostility and the demonization is that you all want to keep poor people poor, and that it's obstructionist, that you're just stalling projects. You don't have a positive idea of how else to do this, and you just want to maintain status quo. So if we stick with the tribal issue, that even before corporates came, the tribals were still poor, So I remember the BJP government, like you said, is escalating this, but the Congress government, someone like Mr. Chidambaram said, do you want them to just stay as hunter-gatherers, So if you were today to address those doubts that people have, another corporate told me, oh, Medha Patkar just stalled that project, but now they don't want to accept that all those tribals have been rehabilitated. And, so there's accusations that activists fudge facts, want to keep people poor, are obstructionist, and have no other positive idea of how to do things. Just resistance is their goal. So how would you dismantle those accusations?
It's a debate that we must have, and we must have openly, without demonizing each other. I think it goes back to the fundamental question that I raised earlier. What do we understand as development? Now, in the neoliberal idea, development is equal to high economic growth. High economic growth basically is the greater and greater production of goods and services that are costed. I mean, women's work, for instance, at home is not costed, but what is costed leads to an increase in GDP. Now, in a very simple sense, let me argue that we have said how much of goods and services are produced is what defines. But there are at least two other questions that I think need to be brought in. The first is, what are you producing? Suppose you're producing, just to take a dramatic example, you're producing guns and luxury items when people don't have decent houses, don't have healthcare, don't have food and clean water. Is that development? Is something that we have to ask. You might say yes, it is, but and the second question is, by what means is this production happening? So if you're getting this very high levels of economic growth by displacing large masses of very poor communities, by paying labor, dirt wages, 9 out of 10 workers are still in the informal sector. We've seen in the pandemic what kind of suffering this leads to. It is on that surplus army of unprotected labor that we have built our development model. And the third is, if we are destroying our environment, our forests, etc. So I have a feeling that my answer to the question is basically, if we interrogate and have an idea of development, which incorporates all these three questions, we have a different imagination, which doesn't exclude your imagination, but incorporates something that expands it. So that's one way of answering the question. I've often argued this even when I was in the National Advisory Council, because at that time, it was quite clear at the highest level that this debate was unresolved. And I said that, even if you believe in market-led economic growth as we understand it, can we have a revised social contract and renegotiate the social contract, saying that while people make huge amounts of money, let there be a floor of human dignity below which no one is allowed to fall. And we can debate no child should sleep hungry, no child should die because they can't afford hospital care, no child should have to work instead of being in a decent school, and decent, as good as your and my children could enjoy. No old person should have to work till their last day. These are elementary things. People like Prabhat Patnaik have calculated it would cost about 10% of the GDP. Where will the money come from? Our tax to GDP ratios are among the lowest. It's about 14%. Even the US is about 24%. If we just agreed on this, we would have taxed the rich more, have an inheritance tax, etc., etc. So I think that that's how I would answer in a very measured way, without name calling. And then if you still oppose it, at least be clear that you're opposing this imagination.
Yeah, rather than labeling it as criminal or anti-national. Yeah,
absolutely. And one last thing is that, I think that the, COVID, our denial of public health, our destruction of whatever foundations of public health we had built. I was the son of an IAS officer, but I remember in my entire childhood, we used to go to a government dispensary when we fell ill and sat in line with everybody else. Nobody thought about, except the very rich, about going to private clinics. Now what has happened is that we in the middle class have, in a sense, seceded from public hospitals, public schools, colleges, etc. And we feel, how do we care what happens to everybody else? We will enjoy the best. I think that we saw in COVID times that actually the 80%, I'd underline, of doctors in this country work for the for-profit health sector. Now, when COVID hit us, we found that the private sector did very little except make huge profits. And so we in the middle class actually are so vulnerable because we allowed the destruction of public systems. So I think that, no one is safe until everyone is safe. Can we absorb that into even a self-directed thinking about development?
You mentioned something very important right now. You said that at least this debate should happen. And out of the friction of that debate, a new middle ground will emerge, where the justice is served or equity is served. And of course, it's a evolving process. And I wanted to remind the audience that it is, when you all were part of the National Advisory Council, there was a lot of hostility to that. But the NREGA, the right to education, the right to information, food security bill, so many things came out of the National Advisory Council, which has kept India safe today. So even the BJP, even Mr. Modi, who mocked these schemes, are now actually using those schemes to create a safety net, So like I said, out of that friction, something more evolved and expanded for common good will arise.
If I can just supplement very briefly, just look at the United States. It's really interesting today. Joe Biden and his team are proposing measures that in India would be considered rank sort of left-wing socialist measures. In COVID, every American, for instance, is being given a certain amount of cash transfer, a significant amount of cash transfer, which has helped them through this period. And it has also helped the economy. In fact, I always believe that compassionate economics is also sound economics in the end. If we had done cash transfers, we were saying pay the equivalent of minimum wages to every Indian. It will cost about 3% of the GDP, and it will help them through this difficult period. And if they had done it, actually, I think that the damage to our GDP growth would have been actually much less. So what we're talking about is actually increasingly being acknowledged, even in sort of completely avowedly capitalist countries like the United States. And the World Bank is saying, we were wrong about saying that you should have only private health care. A public health system is important. A public school education system is important. Can we in the middle class in India at least keep up with the lessons of the global experience and reimagine an India which, as I said, makes us safe because everybody else is safe.
And I just wanted to emphasize another point there, for those who do feel that they are confused by the, polarized kind of conversation around activism or activists, is that very often government, lawyers, even courts now speak when activists like Stan Swamy or Binayak Sen or Sudha Bhardwaj or you are on the field helping people articulate their rights or even become aware of their rights. And then obviously when they become aware of their rights, they're not so compliant, they're not so docile. It's not seen as you transmitting constitutional values, but that you're like instigating people who would not otherwise resist, So can you just very briefly take that on, that, why do we use this vocabulary that you're instigating rather than educating?
Because we have become so comfortable as beneficiaries of an economic, political, social order, which in many ways violates the Constitution. I think one of the finest moments since independence was the anti-CAA struggle of 100 days. I found beautiful about that struggle was that its icon was the Constitution. And I was almost every day invited to some corner of the country where I was speaking to large crowds. And it was, yeah, and the national flag, the national anthem, and the constitution. They reclaimed it. And in every protest gathering would have only the national flag. There'd be no other national flag. You have Hindus and Muslims together standing. And it would end normally with a young girl reading out the preamble of the constitution and maybe 1 lakh people repeating it after her. And, I'd get goosebumps. But in smaller gatherings, I would often talk to them, what does this constitution mean? And I think if you summarize it in 4 words, you're talking about justice. And in Hindustani, it resonates much more. You're talking about insaf. Sabke liye insaf, barabar ka insaf. Liberty is azadi. The very contested word azadi. And we're saying not azadi from India, but azadi in India. And there are freedoms that were guaranteed to us of freedom of speech, of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. We're talking about these. So, insaf, azadi, equality, barabari. At the core, we are all equal in dignity, equal in rights. And fourth, fraternity, which I think is perhaps, and Ambedkar had said, was the foundation of all of these, which is fraternity. Fraternity as an English word actually has a problem because it literally means brotherhood and leaves out the sisterhood. But the Hindi word in our constitution is beautiful. It is bandhuta, which literally means hum ek dusre se bandhe hue hain, we're bound to each other. That if Pehlu Khan is being beaten on his back, the pain emerges on my back. When your child dies because she can't afford hospital care, I feel that the pain that I have lost my own. And I think that is the core idea of fraternity. When we talk about these issues, the trouble is that they sound so radical. The Constitution has become an icon of radical resistance. Love, and all my speeches were about how important love was. Police in many charge sheets, in affidavits to the Supreme Court and the High Court, have said that he was fostering hate by talking about love. It's at least 100 years since we've been having this debate. Gandhiji had come in the freedom struggle, said India would be a country that would be humane, inclusive, would include all people of all faiths, castes, languages as equal citizens. We had the RSS 1925, the Hindu Mahasabha, around 1918-19, saying that no, this is a country of basically caste Hindus and others would be second-class citizens. I think that debate has reached a very critical point. And people need to understand that the received common sense that they have about what constitutes growth, what constitutes love for your nation. We are being told that you can only prove you love your nation by hating all other nations. You can love your religion only by hating people of all other religions. Some of us are saying, no, the only way I can love my religion is to respect and love every other religion. And I love my nation, but I have goodwill to people. I mean, when this young 19-year-old girl on a platform, Amulya, said, Hindustan Zindabad, Pakistan Zindabad, and she was charged with sedition and thrown into jail, and even Owaisi sort of got alarmed and threw her out. She was trying to say something very fine to all of us. She said, why should I wish ill to the people of Pakistan or the people of any country? I can oppose the system, I can oppose the government, but we must wish well to people of every country. So I think there are many aspects to this reimagination. And I think, what we're talking about is different imagination for the world. Every second Indian is below the age of 25. What kind of country do they want to grow up in and leave for their children? Is, I think, ultimately what all of these battles are about.
You said something really powerful, and I think which completely sums up our conversation in one line, which is that the Constitution itself has become a radical document. Like you said, that the fact that you were accused of hate mongering or sedition is a true inversion, because they could track every single speech of yours. And I know that from many years of following your work, is that you have always and only spoken of peace. So the inversion is really, really stark there. The second paradigm now is national security, Harsh. And again, if one is fair to those who are tasked with looking after the harder end of security, you know. So I would think that activists are also serving national security, because when you allow people to participate in democracy, you actually are creating safety channels for anger to not become violent, not become militant. You're keeping faith with the constitution. But let's look at those who are tasked with the hard task of protecting borders, preventing terror attacks, etc. You know, so for them the paradigm is different. So let's look at the Bhima Koregaon case, that if these letters have been found on computers, or even Muslim boys who are picked up on suspicion of being a part of terror cells or sleeper cells, rather than take a position that they're automatically innocent, what would you argue is a fair way? So for instance, if these letters have been found on these activists' computers, you and I may know them personally, we've known their work, we trust their canvas and landscape of work over 30, 40 years. But assuming an agency has found this letter on the computer, what would be the fair approach to this? You know, rather than just insisting that they're innocent, by the letter of the law, what is the fair way that this should be addressed?
I think that's a very important question, Shoma. What we are pleading for is actually we've struggled a very long time on a certain set of principles about how a person's guilt or innocence can be established, and what happens in the interim while this is being done. So the question of bail, firstly, bail should happen unless you have very strong reason to believe that the person will flee or tamper with the evidence. So that's one principle. The second is that you're innocent until proved guilty. There should be no kind of media battle against you. If they do believe in both the Delhi riots and Bhima Koregaon that they have evidence, have the confidence of placing the evidence very quickly before a court of law, giving you and the prosecution the opportunity to prove or disprove this. That figure of 2.2% conviction in UAPA is very significant because you're actually not succeeding in defending India's security. In fact, you're doing the reverse by these easy sort of escape paths where you casually can pick up soft targets or dissenters. There are people who are committing terrorist acts. What I'm arguing is that if we do away with these extraordinary laws and hold the police, the NIA, the executive in general accountable to present evidence that can stand up in a court of law, then by all means go ahead. But now that we have the tragedy of, I don't think it has weighed on the conscience of our people nearly as much as it should. I'm working closely with somebody called Amir Khan, who was put in jail, charged with terror crimes at the age of 18. He came out after 14 years. His story has been written. And I felt that we as society owe him care. And so he works with me. And he often talks about that time, how he lost his father, who had spent years, how they were completely alone, isolated. His mother, who had never stepped out after that, was at every court hearing. When he came out, 14 years, he was declared innocent. He came out and he said the world had changed. He didn't know what internet was. He didn't know shops had been converted into malls. He didn't know that there was a metro system. And he had to restart life all over again. But who was responsible for framing him? And as I said, whatever he was framed for, there were people responsible for it who obviously were not imprisoned.
Got away, yeah.
Who got away because you. So far from helping public security, you actually have endangered our collective security by easy recourse to these kinds of laws. I think that's something that we need to understand. Laws which follow, actual principles of natural justice are actually much more effective in achieving the objectives that we set out to accomplish. So these laws are not helping national security.
So Harsh, I want you to address another doubt that people have, and forgive me for not only being an echo chamber, because I'm very keen to address the doubts that people have.
I'm delighted to do a conversation with alternative viewpoints, because that's the kind of conversations we need to have.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate, it may not be my alternative viewpoint, but I definitely want to channel that alternative viewpoint, which is that, when you're talking about activism and Maoists, because that's like within the country, that is a construct of fear in people's heads that they are creating unrest in the country and insurgency. And of course, that's also true, and there's violence in their ideology. So there are some activists like Stan Swamy, Sudha Bhardwaj, Binayak Sen, whose decades of work, the most ill-intended security agency would find it hard to find any act of violence that any of you have participated in, or any affinity that you have exhibited with the Maoist ideology. But there are other activists who are also fighting for similar causes, for justice, for equity, who may have an affinity or ideological or intellectual affinity with the Maoist vision of the world. How do you think the state should treat them in a democracy? How should the government treat them?
Well, I'm personally, ideologically, philosophically, ethically opposed to any form of violence to accomplish political ends. There is no such thing as altruistic violence. Violence, if you're saying I'm going to build the most just and humane society in the world by means that are the most unjust and inhuman, I think that it's doomed to failure. Many of us are being called Maoists. I mean, that's one kind of problem. Including the Prime Minister, actually, incidentally, in his speeches in 2014, had mentioned me a couple of times as a Maoist. And it was quite, it was extraordinary that this charge was being laid on me. But I think that the question you've asked is the more difficult one, but a very important one.
And sorry, so that the audience is clear about what I'm asking, is that there's a clear zone of illegality and criminality from the state and government's perspective, which are those who are participating in Maoist violence. I'm asking about those who have an intellectual affinity with their worldview. So violence is a very clear argument.
Exactly. The Supreme Court, in some of its judgments, has laid down that holding beliefs, Maoist beliefs, is not an act of terror. And many of the leaders who are Maoists actually are extremely idealistic and believe in equality and justice. So I think with them, the appropriate response is one of debate, respectful debate, open debate, and let people understand the different choices that there are. It is only when there is an active incitement to violence or participation in preparation for violence or actually engaging in violence that a crime is conducted. And I think we need to understand that difference.
Yeah. So, Harsh, we're going to run out of time, sadly. So I just want to very quickly address what is this idea of nation that, say, the government stands for and that activists like you stand for. And the other is communalism. A lot of your work has, over the last few years, been focused through Karwa Mohabbat.
On nationalism, I did speak earlier that your love for your nation doesn't mean that you believe everything. Any criticism of your government is not moving you away from love for your nation. In fact, you love your nation so much that you feel it is important to speak out when you see either your government or your fellow countrywomen or men. If you're speaking out against Dalit exploitation, gang rape, inequality, hunger, communal violence, lynching, you're doing it because you love your nation. And those who actually are perpetrating this, in our view, are harming the idea of a nation. Last question is, I think, the most critical. When I talked about 100-year war, I think most of all, it was about this question about who does this country belong to and who does it not belong to? And on what terms is this belonging laid down? At its best, when we talk about the idea of India, as incorporated in the freedom struggle led by Gandhi and in the constitution led by Dr. Ambedkar, and in the first decade of our nation building led by Nehru. It was a humane, inclusive idea that this country belonged equally and underlined equally to people of diverse faiths, uh, caste, communities, gender, ethnicity. There was an equal belonging. This idea of belonging without conditionalities, without any kinds of obligations except an adherence to the constitution, is to my mind one idea. And the alternative idea we know about the Hindu nation, that this is ultimately a nation of Hindus, the natural land of people of Hindu faith, and particularly less clearly articulated caste Hindus, and even less clearly articulated caste Hindu men. They represent and North Indian caste Hindu men. They represent increasingly the Indian identity. And everybody who's not that in different levels in terms of gender, caste, but most of all in religion, become second-class citizens and have to live in, as sort of second-class citizens, deferential to the sentiments of the majority.
So Harsh, when we're looking at Stan Swami's death, it's actually like we've been talking, there's a huge hinterland of other arrests, their students, their activists, which he himself spoke of, scholars, journalists, who've all been arrested for sedition or terror laws or NIA, for NSA, and been called anti-national, a spectrum of what being anti-national is. What does this say about the state and the way the state is looking at it? And if you were to use Stan Swami's death also to address the media and the way the media is, actually communicating this world, what would you say?
Well, firstly, I think that the state has shown how terrified it is, truly, of dissent. And it's frightened of independent intellectuals. It's frightened even more of young people. And universities were supposed to be a place where you had the freedom to say things that you might actually revise when you grow older, but it had to be a safe space for people to understand the world, to articulate the understanding of the world. And I think that above all, it is how insecure the state is. It presents us a strong man, two strong men kind of image. But truly, it is terrified. And I love the way when these three young people emerged from prison. To me, it will remain a symbol. I mean, Natasha had lost her father, was not able to be on his bedside. Devangana was in jail with no bail. And this young Asif Tanha, who comes from a very humble background, I just love the expressions on their faces, the defiance standing outside prison. And Asif Tanha, of course, he took the time on his mask to actually write no NRC, no CAA, and to put it on and to stand outside the prison and say, I'm going to continue to battle. They're frightened of a young person like that. I think that, and to my mind, that is also the hope. That's also the hope. The power of our peaceful dissent comes through. They're frightened of Asif Tanha, who among the youngest, and they're frightened of Stan Swami, who is the oldest person ever charged of terror in this country. So that's one thing I want to say about the media. I think that when the history of our times is written, the complicity of the media in endorsing and amplifying the version of the state, both vis-a-vis dissenting voices and vis-a-vis the questions of equality and equal citizenship. I think the mainstream media will be held culpable, gravely culpable, in where India finds itself. Democracy, I don't think has ever been as threatened as it stands today. Even the emergency, which was a terrible time when dissenters, political opponents were put in jail in large numbers, media was censored. It is that kind of time, except that the emergency was not a hate project. And so we see the taking of our freedoms and the building of hate in our hearts today. And the media has been hugely complicit, enabling and supporting and amplifying that project.
Yeah, and I think, speaking as a journalist, that a fundamental break from, the idea of the profession is that in the past it was always clear that the media stood for the people, and it's not that you have to be opposed to the state. When the state does good things, you're supposed to praise it. But you're not an automatic spokesperson for the state, and I think there's a fundamental shift today in the idea of the media itself. And the fact that they perpetuate this idea that anyone who's a dissenter is anti-national. One shouldn't speak of the media as an entirety, but many powerful parts of the media. And just to end, just to also address one other piece of this, Harsh, is the courts. So when we spoke of people who are at the receiving end, it's activists, Dalits, students, minorities, tribals. There's the state, the courts, and the media, which are in some ways failing their mandate. So what would you say to the courts?
I think Nazi Germany was a very important reminder that democracy is not only about the will of the majority. Hitler was democratically elected and loved and adored till his death by the majority of the German people. That did not in any way legitimize what he did to the minorities. And therefore, I think that in the way our republic was imagined, the courts had a very important role in the defense of India's minorities, religious minorities, caste minorities, gender, sexual minorities, and so on and so forth. And I think that they have significantly failed us in recent years, over and over again. And that's a long conversation. Part of what reason is being given to charge me with insurrection is what I said to the Jamia students the day after they were beaten. Just that snippet, I'll say that this battle is not about a 1,000-word law. It is about what kind of country do we want to build and leave for our children. And that this is not going to be resolved, I said, in Parliament, because our political parties have not shown the moral courage to stand up. It will not be resolved in the courts, precisely for the reason that they have not stood consistently for the defense of minority rights. It will be resolved in the end by we the people on the streets fighting peacefully. But I did say that there's a fourth place that it is going to be most resolved. And that place is your hearts and mine, whether we've allowed hate to colonize our hearts or whether we've fought against it, thrown it out, and filled it with love and respect for all.
So I just want to push you a little bit on that, Harsh, is that when you were saying that the courts are meant to defend the rights of minorities. So Harsh, just now when you said about that a primary duty of the courts is to defend the minority rights and their position within the constitution, again, that triggers a kind of resistance in people's minds, because there's a sense that, that India or secularists or activists are constantly expressing themselves through a noblesse oblige to minorities rather than a very self-confident, robust, equal citizenship, So would you also want to rephrase that the courts are committed to justice for everyone, regardless of religion? Or are you saying that there's a special, duty towards minorities?
I'll stay with my position because the court has a special duty to those who normal process of say, the ballot and the position of mainstream political parties, budget making, all of them. If you have power on your side, power of numbers, power of your identity, then you need the courts less. For those who are the more and more disempowered, that is where there's a special duty to the of the courts. And I think it was, we are talking about true equality, which recognizes and takes sides actively, openly with those who are living with inequality.
Thank you very much, Harsh. Wonderful talking to you.